On Saturday, February 1st, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order which places 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, and 10% tariffs on imports from China. Canada, Mexico, and China are America's three largest trading partners. Every year, the United States imports $1.2 trillion worth of goods from these three countries, which represents more than 40% of total imports. This did not come as a surprise. Tariffs was one of the key points Trump campaigned on, saying this is how he will bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Just a few weeks ago, Trump said that his tariff policies would generate hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of revenue.
But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
Almost all mainstream economists have said that Trump's tariff policies will be a net negative for the US economy. But if we want to analyze the impacts of tariffs, we don't have to rely on theory alone. Back during Trump's first term, he already enacted tariffs mostly targeting imports from China. In this video, we'll look at how the Trump tariffs of 2018 and 2019 impacted both the US and world economies. We'll then look at what might be different about the new tariffs in Trump's second term. As I was making this video, news broke out that Trump agreed to delay tariffs on Mexico after Mexico agreed to deploy troops to the border. To quickly analyze breaking news topics, I use Ground News, which is also the sponsor of today's video. They're an app and a website that brings together related stories in one place to highlight important perspectives often overlooked by mainstream media. On the topic of US-Mexico tariffs, we can see that over 400 media outlets covered this story. They rank each media outlet on a bias scale, so you can compare the left-wing, right-wing, and centrist perspectives. The left-leaning articles emphasize how this deal may avert the negative economic consequences of the proposed tariffs. The right-leaning articles talk of this as a big diplomatic win for Trump. When researching for videos, I read hundreds of articles per week, and Ground News has become an invaluable tool, allowing me to quickly understand complex news stories from all perspectives. And they're now offering my viewers 40% off their unlimited Vantage plan, the same plan I use to access all their features. That's just $5 per month. In a world where news moves fast and the truth can be hard to find, Ground News helps you see the full perspective. Plus, by subscribing, you're directly supporting my work. So use my link, ground.news/WSM, to sign up today. And now back to the video. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a trade war against China. By the end of 2019, the US had placed tariffs on approximately $350 billion worth of Chinese imports. The impacted product categories included washing machines, solar panels, steel, aluminum, and many others. In general, the US Congress is responsible for tax policies. In most cases, the president cannot unilaterally change tax rates, but tariffs are a major exception. The Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and Trade Act of 1974 give the president broad authority to impose tariffs for the purposes of national security, or if the targeted countries are believed to be engaged in unfair trade practices. National security and unfair trade practices can be interpreted very broadly. So in practice, the president has the authority to impose pretty much any tariffs against any country he wants. In 2019, China responded by imposing tariffs on agricultural products and imports from the United States. In January of 2020, the Trump administration and China signed the so-called Phase 1 trade deal. You can think of this as kind of a ceasefire in the trade war. The two sides didn't resolve all their issues, but they agreed to not impose any further tariffs. They also agreed to roll back some of the existing tariffs. At the peak, the US placed 25% tariffs on $350 billion of Chinese imports. They agreed to reduce this to only $250 billion. In return, China agreed to increase imports of certain US agricultural products. Trump had a few rationales for starting the trade war with China. Firstly, the United States has a massive trade deficit with China. In 2018, the United States imported $560 billion worth of goods from China, while China only imported $120 billion of American goods. Trump accused China of putting up barriers to hamper US imports, as well as subsidizing their own export-focused industries. The tariffs are supposed to reduce the trade deficit and increase American manufacturing jobs. Secondly, the US government will raise billions of dollars from the tariffs, which will improve government finances. Let's see how successful the tariffs were at achieving these objectives. Let's start off by looking at government revenue. Before Trump, most US administrations were supportive of free trade, so tariffs were very low. In 2016, the US generated a little less than $40 billion per year from tariffs. Keep in mind that while this chart is a quarterly time series, the tariff revenue is annualized. At the peak of the trade war in 2019, US tariff revenue increased to $85 billion, so Trump's tariffs resulted in $45 billion of additional revenue for the US Treasury. At the peak in 2019, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on $350 billion of Chinese imports. If you multiply $350 billion by 25%, that's almost $90 billion. But tariff revenue only increased by $45 billion. So what happened? Before the tariffs were implemented, the US imported $350 billion worth of goods from China in the affected product categories. Where possible, US importers started sourcing products from other countries in order to avoid the tariffs. Less Chinese imports means less tariff revenue. When Joe Biden was elected, he didn't implement any new tariffs, but he also did not rescind most of Trump's tariffs, so the China tariffs largely remained in place. Tariff revenue peaked in 2022 at almost $110 billion. Government stimulus created a post-pandemic surge in consumer demand. This caused a surge of imports from China despite the tariffs. In 2022, the federal government's total tax revenue was $4.9 trillion. So the $110 billion of tariffs was only about 2% of total government revenue. Of course, generating tax revenue is not the only purpose of tariffs. It's not even the primary purpose. The primary goal of tariffs is to encourage more manufacturing in the United States. Manufacturers outsource production to foreign countries where labor is cheaper. A tariff can offset the difference in labor costs. The most successful part of Trump's tariffs was a tariff on washing machines. This tariff impacted washing machines imported from any country, not just China. Shortly after the tariffs were announced, the South Korean companies Samsung and LG built washing machine factories in America. The American company Whirlpool also expanded its factory in Ohio. Had it not been for the tariffs, this expansion would have happened in Mexico instead. This indeed created over 1,000 manufacturing jobs. But at what cost? The history of the washing machine tariffs is actually quite interesting. Back in the 2000s, South Korea was the largest producer of washing machines. Samsung and LG are two of the biggest washing machine brands in the world, and they used to make most of their washing machines at home. The United States is also a major washing machine manufacturer, with Whirlpool being the largest American washing machine company. In 2012, the Obama administration imposed tariffs on South Korean washing machines. They accused the South Korean government of providing subsidies to washing machine producers and exporting them to the US at artificially low prices. To avoid the tariffs, Samsung and LG relocated their washing machine production to China. China has significantly lower wages than South Korea. The lower wages in China allowed LG and Samsung to decrease the prices of their washing machines. This caused their market share in the US to increase. The Obama administration's tariffs backfired, achieving the opposite of the intended effect. In 2016, the Obama administration imposed tariffs on Chinese washing machines. These were very similar to the tariffs they previously imposed against South Korea. In response, Samsung and LG relocated their washing machine production to Mexico and other low-cost countries. None of the jobs came back to America. Overall, the Obama administration's tariff policies were completely ineffective. Trump's tariffs were different. They applied to all foreign countries. The only way to avoid the tariffs is to make washing machines within the United States. Shortly after the tariffs were announced, Samsung built a new factory in South Carolina, and LG built a new factory in Tennessee. In 2019, a group of researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research published a study analyzing the economic impact of Trump's washing machine tariffs. The tariffs created 1,800 new manufacturing jobs in the US. Labor costs in the US are significantly higher than in Mexico. To maintain their profit margins, the washing machine manufacturers increased prices by 12%. In aggregate, this price hike cost American consumers $1.54 billion per year. The government collected $82 million of tariff revenue. The tariff revenue was very low because the vast majority of production moved to the United States. If we take the cost to consumers and subtract the tariff revenue, we get $1.46 billion per year. This is the net cost to the US economy. If we divide the $1.46 billion cost by the 1,800 jobs, we get about $800,000 per job per year. I don't know how much the factory workers get paid, but it's a hell of a lot less than $800,000 per year. Tariffs do work. They indeed brought manufacturing jobs back to America, just as Trump promised. But this can come at an exorbitant cost. While washing machine tariffs impacted all countries, most of Trump's 2019 tariffs targeted China specifically. The tariffs against China were wide-ranging. Affected product categories included aircraft parts, televisions, medical devices, satellites, and batteries. As a result of the tariffs, U.S. imports from China declined by 16%. As a result of China's retaliatory tariffs, U.S. exports to China declined by 11%. America's trade deficit with China indeed decreased from about $440 billion in 2018 to $370 billion in 2019. In response to the tariffs, many companies relocated their production from China to other low-cost countries, mostly in Southeast Asia. One of the biggest beneficiaries was Vietnam. As U.S. imports from China declined, imports from Vietnam surged. If we look at America's total trade deficit with all countries, it declined marginally in 2019, but then surged to record highs in the following years. Trump's goal of reducing the trade deficit largely ended in failure. Now let's fast forward to Trump's second term in 2025. He has proposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, 10% tariffs on China, and he has also indicated that he plans to place tariffs against the EU. These tariffs are far broader than what he did in his first term. If he follows through with these policies, he may very well succeed in reducing America's trade deficit. But is that even a good thing? Back in the 1970s, the Japanese economy was booming, mostly thanks to export-focused industries. Japanese-made products were gaining market share in the US, resulting in a widening trade deficit. Many commentators and politicians advocated for protectionist trade policies, including tariffs. Here's a short clip of the famous economist Milton Friedman explaining why protectionism is not the right answer.
We hear from the American steel industry that in Japan, for instance, steel producers are producing at less than cost with support of the government so as to keep employment up there. And as a result, the American steel industry here is not going to be able to compete. So they're going to shut down, and we're going to have higher unemployment here. What is your answer to that?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's a very easy answer. Let us suppose for a moment that the Japanese flood us with steel. That will reduce employment in the American steel industry, no doubt. However, it will increase employment elsewhere in America. We will pay for that steel with dollars. What will the Japanese do with the dollars they get for the steel? They aren't going to burn them. They aren't going to tear them up. If they would, that would be best of all. Because there's nothing we can produce more cheaply than green pieces of paper. And if they were willing to send us steel and just take back green pieces of paper, I can't imagine a better deal. But they're not going to do that. They're not stupid. They're smart people. They're going to use those dollars to buy goods and services. They're going to spend them. In the process of spending them, they may spend them directly in the United States. And that directly provides employment in the United States. They may spend them in Brazil or in Germany or in China or anywhere else. But whoever gets them in turn is going to spend them. So the dollars that we spend for the steel will find their way back to the U.S. as demand for U.S. goods and services. You will have less employment in the steel industry. You will have more employment in the industries producing the goods we export. Overall, total employment will not be affected. But overall, the American consumer will be benefited because he will get the steel more cheaply and the goods made from the steel more cheaply than he otherwise would. That's the benefit to the American consumer. The people who are going to lose their jobs in steel are very visible. They're a collective group. You can name their names. Suppose we restrict imports from Japan. Then people are going to lose their jobs in these export industries. They will be widely spread over the country. You and I couldn't name one person. But that doesn't mean they're any less real. But the greater propaganda effect of the steel industry is because you can set the visible is a more potent political force than the invisible people who will lose their jobs. Now, with respect to the charge that the Japanese government is subsidizing the export of steel, number one, is very dubious that it's true, but suppose it were true. Then that would be a foolish thing for the Japanese to do from their own point of view. But why should we object to their giving us foreign aid?
While this clip is from 50 years ago, the key points are just as relevant today. Think back to the washing machine example. The new factories are very high profile and make media headlines. Trump can go to Whirlpool's factory in Ohio for a flashy photo op. Millions of Americans are now paying a few $100 extra to buy washing machines. This does not get nearly as much media attention. The trade deficit is the value of exports minus the value of imports. In 2023, which is the most recent year we have data for, the United States exported $3 trillion worth of goods and services to the rest of the world. The United States imported $3.8 trillion worth of goods and services from the rest of the world. This resulted in a trade deficit of $800 billion. The word deficit has a negative connotation. It sounds like a bad thing, like you're somehow losing money. But is it really a bad thing? As Americans, we get $3.8 trillion worth of stuff from the rest of the world, while we only have to give $3 trillion in return. Why should we complain about such a favorable arrangement? If anything, countries like China with large trade surpluses, they're the ones getting ripped off. Over the past 20 years, the US has cumulatively posted many trillions of dollars worth of trade deficits. Foreigners have accumulated trillions of US dollars, which they have not yet used to buy US products. So what are they doing with this money? They're mostly buying US stocks and bonds. Thanks to the rule of law and relative political stability, the United States is an attractive place for foreigners to invest. The United States stock market is worth $54 trillion. This is approximately the same size as all other countries combined. Part of this is due to the high valuations of US stocks. The US stock market has a price-to-earnings ratio of 26, which is higher than any other major country. Foreigners make huge amounts of US dollars from their trade surpluses. But instead of buying American-made goods, they instead buy American stocks and bonds. This pushes up valuations of American financial assets. Eventually, foreigners will decide that they have enough US investments, and they will finally use their US dollars to buy American-made products. At some point in the future, America will have to run trade surpluses. We can't keep eating free lunches forever. This will happen naturally regardless of tariffs. In the meantime, why not enjoy the massive quantities of cheap stuff we can import from all over the world? Currently, the US economy is doing pretty well. The unemployment rate is 4.1%, which is at or near full employment. The one aspect of the economy that is not doing so great is inflation. In December, consumer prices increased 2.9% versus the prior year. This is significantly above the Fed's 2% target. Trump's tariffs are the opposite of what the US economy needs. Yes, it will bring back manufacturing jobs, but we already have full employment. So this will just displace jobs that people already have, and this will inevitably cause consumer prices to increase when inflation is already above target. While almost all economists oppose tariffs, there have been examples throughout history of countries implementing tariffs and other protectionist policies to great effect. Take the example of Japan. By the end of World War II, its previously formidable industrial base was largely destroyed, and many of its skilled workers had been killed. The post-war Japanese government implemented a number of protectionist policies, including tariffs, import quotas, and subsidies to export-focused industries. Within just 30 years, they developed a world-class manufacturing industry, far surpassing anything they had before the war. Another example is South Korea. During the post-war period, they implemented some of the most extreme protectionist policies ever. Imports of certain product categories were not just tariffed, but completely banned. The government coerced banks to give subsidized loans to export-focused industries. These policies were a huge success. In the space of 50 years, South Korea turned from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest. This seems to fly in the face of Milton Friedman and other neoliberal economists who oppose protectionism. So what can explain this seeming contradiction? Let's look at the example of South Korea. Following the end of the Korean War in the 1950s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, poorer even than North Korea. The economy was based primarily on agriculture, with almost no heavy industries. The only advantage they had was cheap labor, but the country's industrial infrastructure was virtually non-existent. If you wanted to start a factory in Korea, you would need to invest a huge amount of money to develop a supply chain, train the workers, etc. This was too costly a proposition for the private sector to consider. The government stepped in with protectionist policies, which forced this industrialization to happen. While this may have been economically inefficient in the short term, it created a large industrial infrastructure and supply chains. The Korean workforce transformed from subsistence farmers to skilled factory workers and managers. This laid the foundation for new industries to develop that eventually became competitive, even without government protection. The situation in the United States today is the polar opposite of South Korea in the 1950s. The reason our manufacturing sector is declining is not because we don't have the ability to manufacture, it's because we don't need to. Thanks to technological innovation, American workers now have jobs that are far more productive than the manufacturing jobs of the past. That's the whole reason why manufacturing was outsourced in the first place. Even if you don't work in a high-tech field, you still indirectly benefit. A waiter in the US does the exact same thing as a waiter in China, but the American waiter makes 3 or 4 times the wage. This is because the other aspects of the US economy, which are more productive, contribute to generally higher wages across the entire workforce. When Samsung builds a washing machine factory in South Carolina, there are 0 positive externalities. Yeah, the American workers will gain expertise in manufacturing, but given how high American wages are, these types of manufacturing jobs will never survive in the United States without continuous government protection. If the tariffs are ever lifted, those jobs will disappear just as quickly as they came. One of the reasons why politicians are so obsessed with manufacturing is that the output is tangible. When you build a washing machine plant, you can see the washing machines rolling off the assembly line. This is very easy to understand. On the other hand, think of an insurance analyst or a social media marketing manager. They're just sitting at a computer all day. It's much harder to visualize what output they're creating. But the fact that somebody is willing to pay for them for those jobs means that they're productive by definition. If anything, they're far more productive than manufacturing jobs that only exist because of economically inefficient government policies. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Trump's tariffs? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching and we'll see you in the next one. Wall Street Millennial, signing out.